All right. Yeah, we are about to get into the Punisher numbers 12 and 13. Just do the creative team here real quick. On Punisher number 12, looks like the on-sale date was June 21st, 1988. Title of this story, or that story, is going to be Castle Technique. Written by Mike Barron, penciled by Whilce Portacio, Scott Williams on inks, and lettered by Kenneth Bruzenak. Also colored by John Wellington. And as we get into issue 13, that was on sale July 19th, 1988. So as we are recording this, almost 38 years ago. Title of that story is Sacrifice Play. Same creative team except for the colorist. Colorist changes to a guy by the name of Mark Chiarello. And just to kind of take a quick look at his story credits, I mean, this is actually his third, according to Mike's Amazing World of Comics, this is his third coloring gig. The first one was January of 1988. He colored the Marvel graphic novel The Shadow, and then he colored Nam number 23, a story called Blue Christmas, and then he did Punisher number 13. So before we get into issue 12, let's talk about the main players. A lot of these main players are going to consist through this issue and into next issue. Of course, we've got the Punisher here, so no need to get into that. Just be aware, in this issue, he sets his sights on a convicted serial killer, but his mission is a little more complicated than simply putting a bullet in him. We have Gary Saunders, a convicted serial killer who has been found guilty of murdering 12 young women and is suspected of killing many more. Saunders is currently sitting on death row in Utah, where years of appeals have delayed his execution. He's also an avid chess player, something that becomes a recurring theme throughout this and the next issue. Then we have Lydia Spoto, a member of the notorious Samson family, and a figure connected to a radical group known as the Underground Liberation Front, ULF. Lydia has a very distinctive look, with bright red hair and a tattoo around one eye, maybe both of them, and it quickly becomes clear that she's surrounded herself with some pretty dangerous people. Bishop, not the Bishop you're thinking of, one of Lydia's associates in the Underground Liberation Front. Bishop is one of the men involved with the group's activities surrounding Saunders, and he and Saunders don't exactly seem destined to become best friends. Ortiz, a contact of Frank's who has been helping him gather information about the prison and Saunders. Ortiz operates mostly behind the scenes, providing Frank with assistance as he puts his plan together. And then Microchip, Frank's longtime partner in technical support. Micro's got a small role here. He helps supply Frank with equipment and information, including some of the specialized gear Frank plans to use during this particular mission. There's your major names for issue 12. Keep those names in mind as Frank heads to Utah with a pretty ambitious plan. And as we're going to find out, not everything is going to go according to that plan. So in the Punisher number 12, Castle Technique, Frank Castle sets his sights on convicted serial killer Gary Saunders, a murderer sitting on death row while years of appeals have kept him alive. Learning that the radical Underground Liberation Front may be planning a prison break, Frank decides to beat them to it, intending to extract Saunders himself and force him to reveal what happened to his still unaccounted-for victims before delivering his own punishment. Hauling a small helicopter and his equipment toward Utah, Frank discovers that members of the ULF are already on his trail, but continues with his elaborate plan, using the helicopter to swoop into the prison and carry Saunders over the walls in a maneuver inspired by the chess move known as castling. Unfortunately, Frank overlooks one crucial detail. Saunders realizes Frank never gave the password, identifying him as one of Lydia's people. Saunders brutally beats Frank unconscious just as Lydia and her armed followers arrive, having tracked Frank to the scene. The rescue turns out to be pure coincidence. Lydia never actually intended to free Saunders. And when Saunders attacks one of her men, Lydia guns him down and steals his watch before the group makes off with Frank's truck, weapons, and helicopter. Left battered and nearly helpless, Frank awakens furious that Saunders died before he could answer for his crimes. only to be rescued at the last moment by his inside contact, Ortiz, setting the stage for Frank to recover his stolen arsenal and settle the score with Lydia and her crew. As far as my thoughts on the Punisher number 12 go, I think this is a pretty solid issue. I wouldn't necessarily call it one of the most memorable issues in the run so far, but there are definitely some things here that I liked. The whole setup with Frank breaking Gary Saunders out of prison is interesting because on the surface, that sounds almost backwards. Frank is usually trying to put criminals down, not bust them out. But there is a reason behind it. Frank had met the mother of one of Saunders' victims, and there are still questions about what happened to some of these women. Frank wants answers, and he wants to give this woman some kind of closure. So even though his plan is incredibly elaborate, it makes sense from Frank's perspective. He's willing to go to some pretty extreme lengths when he decides something needs to be done. Saunders himself is not really much of a character. We know what kind of person he is because Frank tells us what he has done, and that is more than enough to make you want to see the guy get what is coming to him. He murdered at least 12 women and may have killed many more. So there's no question about whether Frank has picked somebody deserving of his attention. But Saunders is basically just a scumbag for Frank to go after. There isn't a whole lot of depth there. What is a little different is Frank's plan for him. Frank doesn't just want to kill Saunders. He wants to keep him alive long enough to get information out of him. And it sounds like he fully intends to torture this guy until he talks. That's pretty dark. 12 issues into this series, I don't really remember Frank doing a lot of that. Usually once he has his target, it's just about finishing the mission and putting the criminal down. Here he's prepared to draw it out, and that adds a slightly nastier edge to what he's doing. I did enjoy the actual prison break. Frank coming in with his little personal helicopter flying over the prison walls, landing, grabbing Saunders, and taking off again is just fun Punisher all over. It is also another example of Frank using some new equipment, which I always enjoy seeing. It's ridiculous, but it's the right kind of ridiculous for this book. And then, of course, there is the chess theme. Mike Baron really lays that on thick in this issue. Saunders plays chess by mail. Frank uses the CB handle Rubber Rook. There's a guy named Bishop. Somebody is talking about going to get King. Frank explains castling when he is making his move on the prison. And then the story itself is called Castle Technique. At some point, you just kind of have to laugh and say, okay, Mike, we get it. We're doing chess. I don't necessarily dislike it, but it does feel very convenient that all of these chess references happen to exist naturally inside the story. It almost feels like Baron started with the idea of using chess terminology and then figured out how many references he could squeeze into the script. One of my favorite little moments, though, is when Frank's plan goes wrong. Saunders realizes that Frank is not really working with Lydia here, because Frank doesn't know the password. And I want to make that distinction because Frank did not forget the password. He never knew there was one. There was just a piece of information that he did not have. And right before Saunders gets the drop on him, Frank is narrating about how he is only human, that he makes mistakes. And then almost immediately, he gets cracked in the head with a piece of wood. That's pretty funny timing, but what follows is not pretty funny at all. Saunders absolutely beats the hell out of Frank. This is probably the thing that stood out to me the most in the entire issue. Frank gets brutally beaten. Saunders hits him again and again, and by the time it's over, Frank is bloody, barely conscious, and in really bad shape. We've seen Frank get hurt before in this series. We've seen him get overwhelmed. We have seen other people have to save him. So the idea that Frank is vulnerable is not something new, but this might be one of the more brutal beatings we have seen him take so far. Then Lydia and the Underground Liberation Front show up, and that gives us another nice twist because they were not even coming to rescue Saunders. Frank thought he was beating them to the punch, but instead, completely by accident, he basically delivered Saunders right to them. Pretty good twist. I still don't know exactly what to think about Lydia yet. She definitely has a memorable look, and we know she's connected to this Samson family, which is very clearly meant to make you think of the Manson family. So that already tells you that we are probably dealing with somebody who's a little unhinged. And then she shoots Saunders in the back several times without much hesitation. So even though I don't know much about her personality yet, we know she's dangerous. And we know she has no problem killing somebody when she decides they're no longer useful. There's some also good dark humor in here, especially the truck stop scene where Frank tells the waitress that he does not do drugs anymore because he found the Lord. And then he tries to talk to her about letting the Lord into her heart. And she basically says she will if he has $50. That's pretty funny. Mike Baron has sprinkled that kind of dark humor throughout this series before, and I think it fits. Frank is such a serious character, and having those strange little moments around him helps keep the book from becoming too grim all the time. The Gary Gilmore references and the whole death penalty atmosphere in Utah were interesting too. I don't know enough about Gary Gilmore to say exactly what Barron was trying to do there, but I did not really read it as some major statement about capital punishment. To me, it felt more like he was using real-world history to give the setting some texture and make Utah feel like a deliberate choice for this story rather than just some random location. But the ending is really where the issue works. Frank's plan completely falls apart. Saunders is dead, so Frank cannot get the answers he wanted for the families of those missing women. He's been beaten nearly unconscious. Lydia and her people have stolen his truck, his weapons, the helicopter, and basically Frank has just supplied the Underground Liberation Front with a whole bunch of equipment they didn't have before. Not good. And then Ortiz arrives, drags Frank into the Jeep, and gets him out of there. That makes for a pretty effective cliffhanger, because Frank ends the issue about as badly off as he possibly could. His mission failed, he lost his target and his gear, and now he's got to figure out how to recover from all this. And I think that's more interesting than if Frank's plan had worked perfectly. Had he simply broken Saunders out, tortured him for information, killed him, and gone home, I don't know how much there really would have been to this story. Having everything go wrong gives us a much better reason to come back for the next issue. So overall, I would call The Punisher number 12 a good, solid Punisher story. I don't think Mike Baron is doing anything wildly experimental here. We've seen Frank get hurt and overwhelmed before. We've seen missions go sideways, but the severity of the beating, the chess motif, the helicopter prison break, and especially Frank accidentally handing a radical group a truckload of weapons, give this issue enough personality to kind of stand out. It's not necessarily one of my favorite issues of the series so far, but it does exactly what the first part of a multi-issue story needs to do. It puts Frank in a terrible situation and leaves me wanting to see how he gets himself out of it. Now we get into issue 13, a story called Sacrifice Play. Again, let's take a look at the main characters. We have Frank Castle. We've already talked about him. We've got Ortiz. We've mentioned him already. Then we have Conchita Ortiz. Yeah, you're going to find out a little bit about her. This is Ortiz's wife. Lydia's back, of course. And then we get to meet Charlie Samson, the imprisoned leader of a violent cult known as the Samson family. He's a manipulative, ruthless killer whose followers remain completely devoted to him, even after years behind bars. So we pick up immediately in issue 13, right after we left off in the previous issue. Frank Castle's waking up, badly injured inside a remote cabin. Ortiz is there with him and explains that he followed Frank because he wanted to see Gary Saunders get what was coming to him. Ortiz also reveals that he knows Frank is the Punisher and remembers him from Vietnam, where Frank once saved his life. Feeling that he owes Frank a debt, Ortiz offers to help him track down Lydia Spoto and recover the truck, weapons, and helicopter stolen by the Samson family. Frank believes Lydia plans to use his equipment to free Charlie Samson, the imprisoned leader of the violent Samson cult. Ortiz agrees to help, but only on one condition: that he brings his wife, Conchita. Frank is skeptical, but Conchita quickly proves that she is no ordinary bystander. She's physically imposing, educated in psychology and criminology, and convinced that her purpose in life is to act as an avenging angel by killing people who deserve it. Frank recognizes that both Ortiz and Conchita may be a little too eager to follow in his footsteps, but he needs their transportation and assistance, so the three head into the mountains. Their search leads them to the Connor Movie Ranch, an old hideout associated with the Samson family. Frank explains that Charlie Samson led his followers in the brutal murder of a pregnant woman and several others in 1972 as part of a supposed war against wealthy capitalists. Frank, Ortiz, and Conchita conduct reconnaissance around the ranch and confirm that Lydia's group is there, along with Frank's stolen truck and helicopter. While they wait, Conchita makes an advance toward Frank, but he immediately shuts her down and tells her that she and Ortiz should consider professional counseling. The following morning, Ortiz learns that Samson is being transferred to another federal prison. When Frank notices that the stolen truck and helicopter have left the ranch, he realizes Lydia's people are already moving to intercept the transport. Frank warns Conchita that he placed explosives behind the truck's license plate, which can be detonated by shooting it, but he makes it clear that they cannot use that option if the police officers are nearby. Meanwhile, Charlie Samson is being moved under heavy guard. Even while restrained, Samson taunts the officers and boasts that his followers will free him. His prediction quickly comes true when Lydia's men ambush the prison convoy, shooting the motorcycle officers and opening fire on the transport vehicle. Samson attacks the guard inside, while his followers finish off the surviving officers. Once he's free, however, Samson immediately demonstrates just how ruthless he is. Worried that two of his own men know too many of his secrets, he grabs a shotgun and kills them both before Lydia arrives. Frank and Ortiz catch up with the stolen truck and overpower one of the men unloading a motorcycle. Frank takes the bike and races after Samson, while Ortiz and Conchita remain behind to deal with the rest of the group. Lydia arrives in Frank's helicopter and lowers it close enough for Samson to climb aboard. As Frank approaches on the motorcycle, the helicopter takes off with Lydia, Samson, and the pilot Ernie inside. The added weight makes the helicopter slow enough for Frank to pursue it through the rocky terrain. Samson soon asks Lydia whether she knows how to fly. When she admits that Ernie is the only pilot, Samson abruptly kicks Lydia out of the helicopter, apparently sending her falling to her death. He then threatens Ernie and forces him to continue flying. Frank races his motorcycle up a steep rock formation and opens fire on the helicopter. Samson shoots back, but one of Frank's bullets strikes Ernie in the head. With the pilot dead, the helicopter begins to fall. Samson tries to steer the crashing aircraft directly toward Frank, forcing him to race for his life as it came down behind him. Frank barely escapes before the helicopter crashes and explodes. As Frank gets back to his feet, he hears someone calling for help. Samson has somehow survived the crash, but he cannot feel his legs and realizes that he may be permanently paralyzed. Rather than return to prison crippled, Samson begs Frank to kill him. Frank draws his knife and grants the request without hesitation. Frank then begins heading back toward Ortiz and Conchita, but their situation is also falling apart. Police are closing in and the remaining members of Lydia's group are still nearby. Ortiz shoots one of the gunmen hiding beneath the truck, then decides that he will not allow himself to be taken alive. Saying that riding with the Punisher was enough for him, Ortiz points his weapon at the truck's booby-trapped license plate and fires. The resulting explosion destroys the truck and kills Ortiz along with it. Conchita screams as she sees her husband die, but she is forced to flee in the Jeep. From a distance, Frank sees the smoke rising from the explosion and realizes what has happened. With the police closing in, his equipment destroyed, Samson dead, Lydia apparently gone, and Ortiz sacrificed, Frank has no choice but to disappear on foot into the empty, rocky landscape. And that is where we end the issue. Okay, so my thoughts on Sacrifice Play. I thought this was a pretty good conclusion to the two-part story that began in the previous issue. Issue number 12 was really about watching Frank's plan completely fall apart. He was beaten nearly unconscious, Gary Saunders killed before Frank could question him, Lydia and her group make off with Frank's truck, weapons, and helicopter. This issue gives us the payoff to all of that and allows Frank to finally regain some control of the situation. Now, Frank does not exactly walk away from this with much. By the end, his truck is destroyed, most of his equipment's gone, Ortiz is dead. Frank does not even have a vehicle to get himself out of there. He's literally walking off alone into the landscape. The one real victory he gets is that he finally gets his hands on Charlie Samson and delivers the Punisher's version of justice. And for a story like this, I think that's enough. Ortiz becomes a much bigger part of this issue, and we learn that he knew Frank back in Vietnam. Frank once saved his life in a bar in Saigon, and Ortiz has apparently figured out that Frank Castle is the Punisher. I do think that connection is fairly convenient, but it gives Ortiz a legitimate reason to recognize Frank, respect him, and feel like he owes him something. Ortiz does not just want to help Frank out of gratitude, though. He seems genuinely excited about getting involved in Frank's war. He talks like this is something he has been waiting to do since leaving the military. That immediately makes Frank uncomfortable because Frank understands exactly what Ortiz is stepping into. And Frank makes it very clear that once you cross into this world, there is no casually stepping back out of it. You are entering a war, and there are consequences. And then Ortiz tells Frank that his wife is coming with him. At first, Frank reacts about the way anybody probably would. It's almost like your buddy insisting on bringing his wife along on a guy's night out. Except this particular night out involves chasing an armed cult through the mountains. But then we meet Conchita, and she is definitely not the dainty, helpless spouse Frank may have been expecting. She's muscular, physically capable, very educated, and possibly even more intense than Ortiz. Conchita was probably the most interesting new character in this issue for me. She describes herself as an avenging angel and says that her purpose is to kill people who need killing. In a lot of ways, she sees herself as someone similar to Frank. She believes there are evil people in the world who deserve to die, and she is ready to be the person who kills them. But what makes it more interesting is Frank's reaction. Frank's not exactly in a position to criticize somebody for believing criminals deserve death, but he's still suspicious of her. He has rules, and he's very concerned about innocent people being caught in the crossfire, and he's not really convinced that Conchita has those same limits. It's funny watching Frank Castle look at somebody else and think, this person may be a psycho. Ortiz and Conchita both add a nice layer of tension because you are really never completely sure whether they're going to help Frank or screw up the mission. You also wonder whether Frank might eventually decide that they are too unstable to keep around. Then, Conchita makes a move on Frank when they're staking out the ranch. I do think that moment right there was a little unnecessary. We have seen several women become attracted to Frank during this series, and here Conchita goes from identifying with his mission to essentially suggesting that they get together while her husband is nearby. Well, that escalated quickly. And at the same time, it does add to the sense that Conchita is a little unpredictable. She is her own woman, she does whatever she feels like doing, and she appears to be attracted to both Frank's beliefs and the danger surrounding him. Frank shuts it down immediately, though, and suggests that she and Ortiz might want to speak to a counselor. Probably not bad advice. The main villain here is Charlie Samson, who is an extremely obvious stand-in for Charles Manson. Mike Baron has done this kind of thing before, where he takes inspiration from a real-world criminal and creates a version of that person for Frank to punish. Baron lets the real-world history also do a lot of the work. You hear that Samson led a cult, that his followers murdered a pregnant woman and several others, and that he carved a swastika between his eyes. You immediately know exactly who this character is supposed to remind you of. Because of that, Samson does not need a tremendous amount of development here. The reader already understands the type of evil that he represents. And once Samson is freed, Baron piles on several moments to make sure we hate him. He kills two of his own followers almost immediately after they rescue him because they know too many of his secrets. Later, he kicks Lydia out of the helicopter just to reduce the weight and make his escape easier. That genuinely surprised me. I expected all three of them to stay in the helicopter and for Frank to somehow bring it down. I didn't expect Samson to throw Lydia out and apparently send her falling to her death. It is another fairly typical villain moment designed to show that Samson has no loyalty to anyone but himself, but it does work. If he is willing to kill his own followers, then there is no question that this guy deserves whatever Frank has waiting for him. I'm not completely convinced that Lydia is dead, though. We see her fall, but we do not see a body. Comic books have trained me not to believe somebody's dead until we see proof. And even then, sometimes that is not enough. There have already been several characters in this run who could potentially return later, and Lydia may be one of them. The action sequence with Frank chasing the helicopter on the motorcycle, That worked well. The story establishes that the helicopter is overloaded and cannot gain much speed or altitude, and gives Frank the opportunity to race up a rocky terrain, get close enough, and open fire. It is certainly over the top, but it is the kind of over-the-top action that fits a Punisher comic. Frank shoots the pilot, the helicopter begins to go down, and Samson tries to steer the crashing aircraft directly into him. Frank barely gets away before it explodes behind him. And somehow, Samson survives. Obviously, that is convenient because the story wants Frank to personally confront him. I'm fine with that. Frank has spent 2 issues dealing with the fallout from this cult, so it makes sense that this story gives him a final moment with the man responsible. Samson can't feel his legs and realizes that he may be paralyzed. He tells Frank that he does not want to return to prison crippled and asks Frank to kill him. Frank has absolutely no problem granting that request. But I do not think Frank gives Samson an easy death. Frank does not simply pull out a gun and put a quick bullet in him. He draws a knife. We do not see exactly what Frank does, but I think the implication's pretty clear. Samson may have asked to die, but Frank is still going to make sure that it feels like punishment. That was satisfying. Samson does not last very long once he directly crosses paths with Frank, but that is fairly typical for this series. The villain is introduced, we learn enough to understand why he deserves punishment, and Frank delivers it. The other major moment is Ortiz's death. After Frank goes after Samson, Ortiz and Conchita remain behind near the truck. The police are closing in, and Ortiz decides that he will not allow himself to be captured. He shoots the explosive hidden behind the truck's license plate while standing right beside it, destroying the truck and killing himself. I would call the moment tragic, but I'm not sure I would call it heroic. By that point, most of Samson's people are already dead or defeated. Ortiz is not necessarily sacrificing himself to save Frank, Conchita, or a group of innocent people. It feels more like he knows he's going to be arrested and refuses to go to prison. That's an interesting parallel with Samson there. Samson asks Frank to kill him because he doesn't want to return to prison, and Ortiz kills himself because he does not want to go to prison either. They are obviously very different men, but they both chose death rather than confinement. Ortiz's death made sense for Ortiz. He told Frank that this was something he had always wanted to do. He wanted to ride with the Punisher. He understood there were risks, and by the end, he decides that his time is up. Emotionally, I wasn't devastated by his death because we only knew him for a short time, but I understood the choice from his perspective. I do not blame Frank for what happened to Ortiz. Frank told Ortiz about the explosive because it was part of the plan. He did not expect Ortiz to stand next to the truck and use it to kill himself. That was Ortiz's decision. And I do not think Frank would blame himself either. Frank would see it as another casualty of war. Ortiz understood what he was getting involved in, made his choice, and he paid the price. Conchita sees the explosion, screams for her husband, and drives away. I don't know whether we will see her again. The close-up of her crying could potentially set up a return where she blames Frank, but most of the people Frank crosses paths with disappear once their particular adventure is over. My guess is that she's probably gone. The ending of the issue is bleak, but is also very appropriate for the Punisher. Frank begins the issue with 2 people who want to join his war. They believe they understand him, they believe they can do what he does, and by the end, Ortiz is dead, Conchita is gone, and Frank is walking away alone. That reinforces the idea that nobody can safely share Frank's mission. Microchip may be the exception because he usually supports Frank from behind the scenes, although we do know that he has felt a casualty of Frank's war as well. That final image of Frank walking alone works because even when other people admire him or try to follow his example, this is ultimately his burden. As for the chess theme, it continues here obviously with the title Sacrifice Play, Samson referring to himself as a trapped king and several characters being treated like disposable pieces. I was not necessarily searching for some deeper meaning while I was reading it. Mike Barron clearly likes building themes around his story titles and peppering references throughout the script. Here, the chess references are extremely obvious. But I will say that sacrifice play gains a little more meaning by the end. Samson sacrifices his followers. He sacrifices Lydia. Ernie is sacrificed during the escape, I guess. Ortiz sacrifices himself. Nearly everyone in the story becomes a piece removed from the board. Whether that is especially deep, that's another question, but the title does fit. Overall, I liked issue 13 more than issue 12. Issue 12 was mostly about watching Frank's plan fall apart. Issue 13 gives us the payoff. Frank gets back into action, we get a good motorcycle and helicopter chase, Ortiz and Conchita add some unpredictable tension, and Frank finally gets the chance to punish Charlie Samson. It's not a very clean victory. Frank loses most of his equipment, Ortiz dies, and Frank ends the issue stranded and alone. But Frank accomplished the most important part of the mission. Charlie Samson is dead. And for a Punisher story, that makes this feel like a satisfying, appropriately bleak conclusion.